March 19, 1945. The morning that would forever divide Adelheid Bauman's life into before and after began with the smell of frying meat. She stood in the breakfast line at Camp Claybourne, Louisiana, her hollow stomach twisted with the familiar ache of prolonged hunger. Behind her, 7 other German women prisoners shuffled forward in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms hanging loose on frames that had known real starvation in the final months of the war. Heidi, as her fellow prisoners called her, had been captured 6 weeks earlier in Belgium. She was 24 years old, a former radio operator for the Wehrmacht's Communications Division. The journey from the European front to this American prisoner of war camp had been a blur of interrogations, medical examinations, and the constant, gnawing emptiness in her belly that had become her only reliable companion. But nothing had prepared her for what waited at the end of that breakfast line. Sergeant Florence Nakamura, a compact Japanese-American woman with careful hands and kind eyes, stood behind the serving counter. She wore a U.S. Army uniform and an expression that suggested she understood more about being judged by appearance than most people ever would. As Heidi reached the front of the line, the sergeant placed a metal tray before her and began loading it with food. 2 eggs, fried golden and glistening with butter. 3 thick slices of something Heidi would later learn Americans called Spam, the processed meat sizzling and crispy at the edges. A heap of fried potatoes seasoned with pepper. 2 pieces of white bread with actual butter, not the sawdust mixture they had eaten in Germany. A cup of real coffee with steam rising into the cool morning air. And on the side, an orange, its bright color almost obscene in its vibrancy. Heidi stared at the tray, unable to move. Her hands trembled as she gripped the metal edges. Behind her, she heard Gerlinda Zimmerman gasp, then whisper in German, "Is it Sunday? Why are they giving us Sunday breakfast?" The question made perfect sense to anyone who had lived through the final year of war in Germany. A meal like this, if it existed at all, would only appear on the most special occasions. Christmas, perhaps, or Easter, certainly not on an ordinary Tuesday morning, certainly not for prisoners of war who were supposed to be the enemy. Sergeant Nakamura noticed Heidi's frozen stance and spoke in careful, accented English. "You can sit down now. There's more if you're still hungry after." More. The word seemed impossible. Heidi had not heard that word associated with food in over 2 years. She walked to the nearest table in a daze, set down her tray, and simply stared at it. Around her, the other 7 women did the same. None of them touched their food. They just looked at it, their faces reflecting the same confusion, the same disbelief, the same dawning realization that everything they had been told about America might have been a lie. The memory of real hunger had settled into Heidi's bones long before her capture. It began in the autumn of 1943 when she joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in Munich. At 22, she believed the recruitment posters that promised she would be serving Germany's defense, helping to protect her homeland from Allied aggression. Her father, a postal clerk who had lost his left arm in the Great War, had been proud when she enlisted. Her mother had wept but said nothing. The work itself had been tedious but important. Heidi operated radio equipment, transcribing coded messages and maintaining communication links between field units and command centers. She was good at it, her steady hands and patient concentration making her valuable to the officers who relied on clear transmissions. For the first year, life had been almost normal. Rations were small but adequate. The work was demanding, but gave her purpose. She felt like she was contributing to something larger than herself. But by the winter of 1944, everything had changed. The rations had shrunk to portions that left everyone constantly hungry. The bread was mixed with sawdust and ground chestnuts to stretch the flour supply. Meat appeared once a week if they were fortunate, and it was usually gristle and fat. The Auxiliary Corps women joked grimly that they were becoming experts at making soup from potato peels and gratitude from nothing. Heidi watched friends lose teeth from malnutrition. She saw young women in their 20s develop the hollowed eyes and translucent skin of the chronically starved. Her own reflection in the small mirror above her bunk showed a stranger, someone angular and desperate, who barely resembled the round-faced girl who had posed for her enlistment photograph. The Allied bombing campaigns had intensified, and their unit was moved repeatedly to avoid the advancing front lines. Each relocation meant more confusion, less food, and growing whispers that Germany was losing the war. The officers stopped talking about victory and started talking about duty and sacrifice. Heidi noticed how their uniforms also hung looser, how their commands came with less certainty. In January of 1945, her unit had been stationed in a commandeered farmhouse outside Bastogne. They lived on frozen turnips and hard biscuits that had to be soaked in water before they could be chewed. When the American forces overran their position on February the 3rd, Heidi had been too weak to run. She simply raised her hands and surrendered, feeling nothing but relief that the gnawing hunger might finally end. The journey to America had taken 3 weeks. On the transport ship, they received meager rations, enough to keep them alive, but little more. She had arrived at Camp Claybourne weighing less than 90 pounds, her hip bones pressing sharp against her skin, her auxiliary uniform cinched tight with makeshift alterations. That was the Heidi who now sat, staring at eggs and Spam and butter and oranges, unable to comprehend that such abundance could exist in the same world where she had nearly starved. Captain Constance Whitmore had commanded the women's section of Camp Claybourne for 8 months when the transport truck arrived carrying 8 German women prisoners. She stood at attention as Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Fairbanks reviewed the transfer documents, but her eyes tracked the prisoners as they climbed down from the vehicle. They moved with the mechanical precision of people who had learned that survival meant following orders without question. The women wore remnants of their Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, the gray fabric faded and patched. Several had visible darning on their sleeves where insignia had been removed. Their boots were mismatched, clearly scavenged from various sources. But what struck Captain Whitmore most was their size. These women were skeletal. Their faces showed the unmistakable signs of prolonged malnutrition, the kind that went beyond missing a few meals to systemic, grinding starvation. Corporal Maxine O'Brien, who served as head guard, whispered under her breath, "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. They look like they've been starved half to death." Captain Whitmore shot her a warning glance, but privately agreed. She had processed male German prisoners before, and while many showed signs of poor rations, none had looked quite this devastated. The processing took 2 hours. Medical examinations revealed various stages of malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, and in 3 cases, early signs of scurvy. The camp doctor, a gruff man from Philadelphia named Walter Brennan, shook his head as he completed his reports. "These women need immediate nutritional rehabilitation. I'm recommending increased rations and vitamin supplementation." Captain Whitmore assigned the 8 women to Barrack 7, which had been hastily converted to house female prisoners. The facility had been designed for male POWs, and the accommodations reflected that original purpose. But the women seemed too exhausted to care about the austere surroundings. They claimed their bunks silently, unpacking the few personal items they had been allowed to keep. Heidi had chosen a lower bunk near the window. She sat on the thin mattress, her hands folded in her lap, and studied the compound through the wire-reinforced glass. The American camp was orderly and clean. Guards walked regular patrols, but they did not carry their weapons with the aggressive posture she had seen from German soldiers. The buildings were well maintained. There was electricity, running water, and from what she could see, no visible damage from bombing or shelling. That first evening, Sergeant Nakamura brought dinner to the barracks. She carried a large pot of beef stew with vegetables, accompanied by fresh bread and canned fruit. The Japanese-American woman ladled generous portions into metal bowls, her movements efficient but not unkind. "Eat slowly," she advised in her careful English. "Your stomachs aren't used to this much food." The 8 women ate in silence, tears streaming down some of their faces as they tasted meat and bread and fruit that was not rotted or moldy. Everything Heidi had been taught about Americans collided with reality in those first 48 hours at Camp Claybourne. The propaganda film she had watched during her auxiliary training had painted a clear picture of the enemy. Americans were depicted as brutal, materialistic warmongers who treated prisoners with savage cruelty. The newsreels showed footage of destroyed German cities and claimed that American soldiers delighted in civilian suffering. Gerlinde Zimmermann, who bunked above Heidi, had been the most vocal believer in these narratives. She was 26 years old, originally from Stuttgart, where she had worked as a telephone operator before joining the Auxiliary Corps. On their second night in the barracks, she whispered down to Heidi in German, "Why are they feeding us like this? What do they want from us?" The question kept Heidi awake. She tried to reconcile what she was experiencing with what she had been told to expect. Where was the brutality? Where were the cruel guards and starvation rations? Instead, they had been given medical attention, clean bedding, and more food in 2 days than she had seen in 2 months before her capture. Not Burga Seidel, whom everyone called Burgi, had a different theory. She was a practical woman of 32 who had served as a supply clerk. "Maybe this is how they soften us before interrogation," she suggested during breakfast on their third morning. "Make us grateful, make us compliant, then extract information." But the interrogations, when they came, were nothing like what the propaganda had promised. Captain Whitmore conducted the interviews personally, with a German-speaking translator present. She asked basic questions about their units, their duties, and their knowledge of military operations. When Heidi answered honestly that she had only transmitted coded messages without knowing their contents, Captain Whitmore simply nodded and made notes. There was no torture, no threats, no attempts to force confessions about things Heidi did not know. The American captain had even offered her cigarettes, which Heidi declined because she had never smoked. "You're not what I expected," Heidi said carefully in her limited English, the words coming slowly as she searched for the right vocabulary. Captain Whitmore smiled slightly. "I imagine we're not what you were told to expect." She paused, studying Heidi with an expression that seemed more curious than hostile. "Tell me, what did they tell you about Americans?" Heidi hesitated, then answered honestly. "That you were monsters, that you killed prisoners, that you destroyed everything beautiful in the world because you hated culture and refinement." She looked down at her hands. "That you would treat us worse than animals." The captain's expression softened. "And what do you think now?" Heidi could not answer because she did not yet have words for the cognitive dissonance she was experiencing. The morning routine at Camp Claybourne became a daily confrontation with abundance that Heidi could not rationalize. Every day at 0600 hours, the 8 German women lined up for breakfast. Every day, Sergeant Nakamura stood behind the serving counter with her patient smile and her impossible quantities of food. Every day, Heidi expected the portions to shrink for the reality of wartime scarcity to finally assert itself. It never did. By the end of their first week, Heidi had begun keeping a mental inventory of what appeared on their trays. Eggs came in multiple forms, scrambled, fried, or boiled. The Spam appeared at least 3 times weekly, sometimes accompanied by bacon or sausage. There were pancakes with syrup, oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with jam made from real fruit. The coffee flowed endlessly, dark and bitter and real. Not the roasted grain substitute they had choked down in Germany. Lunch brought sandwiches constructed with alarming generosity. Thick slices of ham or turkey, cheese that had not been rationed into translucent slivers, lettuce, and tomatoes that showed no signs of rot. There were apples, sometimes 2 per person. Cookies appeared with such regularity that the women stopped treating them as precious commodities and simply ate them. Dinner was the most overwhelming meal. Sergeant Nakamura prepared dishes that seemed designed to prove that American abundance knew no limits. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, fried chicken with mashed potatoes and gravy, pork chops with green beans, Every meal came with bread, butter, and some form of dessert, cake, pie, pudding, or canned fruit in heavy syrup. While Purga Huber, whom everyone called Purgi, worked up the courage to ask Sergeant Nakamura a question on their 9th day. Speaking in halting English, she gestured at the serving counter and said, "This food is special? For us only?" She seemed to be asking if the Americans were deliberately displaying abundance to impress or manipulate their prisoners. Sergeant Nakamura shook her head. "This is normal, regular soldier rations. Same food the American guards eat." She paused, noticing the disbelief on the women's faces. "You don't believe me?" She gestured toward the guards' mess hall visible through the window. "You can watch them. Same food." Heidi did watch. Over the following days, she observed American soldiers moving through their own breakfast line. The portions were identical. The guards ate the same Spam and eggs, drank the same coffee, consumed the same casual abundance without treating it as anything remarkable. They complained about the food sometimes, grumbling that the coffee was too weak or the Spam too salty, complaints that seemed obscene to women who had survived on turnip soup and sawdust bread. The reality crystallized for Heidi with stunning clarity. This was not propaganda. This was not an elaborate deception designed to extract information. This was simply how Americans ate every day. As a matter of routine, the abundance that would have represented unimaginable luxury in wartime Germany was considered ordinary, even boring, by the soldiers who guarded them. Crescentia Becker, called Zenzi by her friends, began to cry during lunch one afternoon. She was only 19, the youngest of their group. "We were starving," she whispered in German to no one in particular. "We were dying, and they have so much they waste it." She was staring at an American soldier scraping half a sandwich into a waste bin. Florence Nakamura had learned about being viewed as the enemy long before she joined the United States Army. She was born in Sacramento, California, to parents who had immigrated from Japan in 1908. Her father grew strawberries. Her mother kept an immaculate home and taught Florence to cook both Japanese and American dishes with equal skill. She had grown up American in every way that mattered, speaking English without an accent, attending public schools, pledging allegiance to the flag each morning. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor turned every Japanese face into a potential traitor overnight. Florence was 23 years old, working as a secretary in a law office when the evacuation orders came. Her family lost their farm, their home, and their place in the only country they had ever truly known. They spent 2 years in the Tule Lake internment camp in Northern California, behind barbed wire, guarded by American soldiers who saw them as enemies despite their citizenship. Florence had joined the Women's Army Corps 6 months after her release from Tule Lake. When people asked why she would serve a country that had imprisoned her own family, she gave a simple answer: "Because it's my country, the good and the bad both." But the real reason was more complex. She wanted to prove something, though she was not entirely sure what or to whom. Working in the Camp Claybourne kitchen gave her purpose. She had requested the position specifically, knowing that food could be a bridge between people when words failed. She had watched the 8 German women a row, seen the starvation in their bodies and the confusion in their eyes. She recognized that look. It was the same expression she had seen on her own mother's face in the internment camp when they received their first Red Cross care package. On the 10th day, Heidi approached her after breakfast service. The young German woman carried a metal tray with her empty dishes and stood uncertainly at the counter. "Sergeant Nakamura," she said carefully in English, "may I ask you a question?" Florence nodded, wiping down the serving counter. "Of course." "Why are you kind to us?" Heidi's English was improving rapidly, though she still searched for words. "We are enemy, we are German." "Why you give us so much food?" Florence set down her cloth and looked at Heidi directly. She saw a young woman probably close to her own age, intelligent eyes and a too thin face. someone trying to make sense of a world that had stopped following the rules she thought she understood. "Because you're hungry," Florence said simply, "and I have food. It's not more complicated than that." "But your family," Heidi persisted. "The other guards told me your family is from Japan. Japan and Germany we were allies. We fought against America together. You should hate us." Florence smiled sadly. "Should I? My family got put in a prison camp by our own government because of where our grandparents were born. Does that mean I should hate all Americans?" She paused. "Hate is exhausting, and it doesn't fill anyone's stomach." Heidi was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. "In Germany, they told us Americans were cruel, that you had no culture, no honor, that you treated everyone not like you as less than human." "And what do you think now?" Florence asked. March 19th began like any other Tuesday at Camp Claybourne, which was precisely what made it so extraordinary. Heidi woke at 05:30 hours, as she had every morning since her arrival 3 weeks earlier. She dressed in the clean work clothes that had replaced her auxiliary uniform, clothes that actually fit her gradually recovering frame. She washed her face in the barrack sink with actual soap that smelled like flowers. These small normalcies had begun to feel less shocking, which itself was shocking. The morning air was cool as the 8 German women walked to the mess hall for breakfast. Louisiana spring was different from Bavarian spring, warmer and wetter, filled with unfamiliar bird calls and the scent of vegetation that Heidi could not name. Gerlinda walked beside her, and they conversed quietly in German about nothing important, the way people do when they are comfortable together. The breakfast line moved at its usual efficient pace. Sergeant Nakamura stood at her post behind the serving counter, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath her cap, her movements practiced and precise. Heidi had begun to anticipate the rhythm of these mornings. She knew what to expect. Eggs in some form, meat in some form, brother, or bread and butter and coffee and perhaps fruit. The abundance had become predictable, which made it no less miraculous, but somewhat more comprehensible. But when Heidi reached the front of the line, Sergeant Nakamura placed before her a tray that seemed to defy even the generous standards that had been established. 2 fried eggs, their yolks golden and perfect. 3 thick slices of Spam, crisped at the edges. A mound of fried potatoes with onions. 2 pieces of toast with butter and strawberry jam. A cup of coffee. And beside it all, an orange and a small slice of chocolate cake left over from the previous evening's dessert service. Heidi stared at the tray. Behind her she heard Gerlinda gasp, then ask in German the question that immediately formed in Heidi's own mind. "Is it Sunday? Why are they giving us Sunday breakfast?" The question made perfect sense within their shared understanding of how the world worked. In Germany, even before the war's worst privations, a meal like this would only appear on special occasions. Sunday breakfast after church had been the one meal each week when families might have eggs and meat together, when children might taste something sweet, when the week's rations were pooled into one abundant meal that had to carry the memory of plenty through 6 days of making do. But Sergeant Nakamura looked at Gerlinda with an expression of confusion. "Sunday? It's Tuesday." She noticed the women's stunned faces, and her expression softened into understanding. This is regular breakfast, same as yesterday, same as tomorrow. Heidi carried her tray to a table and sat down slowly. Around her, the 7 other German women did the same. They had been eating American rations for 3 weeks now. They had seen abundance every single day, but somehow this morning, this ordinary Tuesday morning, the cognitive dissonance finally achieved critical mass. Ermtraud Weiss, called Trouty, spoke first in a whisper that carried across the table. "Every day is Sunday here. Every single day." The simple observation contained within it an entire philosophical revelation that none of them were quite ready to articulate. Heidi had been given a small notebook and pencil by Corporal Maxine O'Brien during her second week at Camp Claybourne. The red-haired guard from Boston had presented it casually, saying only, "Thought you might want to write. Helps some prisoners process things." Heidi had accepted it with quiet gratitude, though she was not sure what she would write or who would ever read it. That night, sitting on her bunk while the other women slept, she began a letter she knew she could never send. "Dear Mama," she wrote in German, her handwriting small and precise. "I do not know if you are alive. I do not know if our house still stands or if Stuttgart survived the bombings, but I need to tell you about something I have seen that I cannot explain." She described the breakfast trays. She tried to quantify the portions, to make her mother understand the sheer volume of food that appeared 3 times daily, but the words felt inadequate. How could she explain eggs and meat and butter and chocolate to someone who had boiled potato peels for soup? How could she convey that this abundance was considered normal, unremarkable, even slightly boring by the people who possessed it? "They give us more food in one day than we had in a week back home," she wrote. "And Mama, this is not special treatment. This is what they feed everyone. The guards eat the same food and complain that it is monotonous. They complain about having too much Spam, too much. I cannot make sense of it." Gerlinde kept a similar diary, though hers took the form of unsent letters to her younger sister, Clara. She wrote about Sergeant Nakamura, about the Japanese-American woman whose own government had imprisoned her family, yet who showed only kindness to German prisoners. "How can she forgive?" Gerlinde wrote. "How can she serve the country that did that to her? I do not understand this kind of loyalty." Notburga wrote letters to her dead husband, a soldier who had been killed at Stalingrad 3 years earlier. "Heinrich, I wish you could see this place," she wrote. "I wish you could taste this food. I wish you could understand that we were lied to about everything. The Americans are not monsters. They are just people, and they have so much, while we had nothing." The letters accumulated in hidden spaces, tucked between mattress and bed frame, folded into pockets, pressed between the pages of the few books the women had been allowed. They were confessions written in darkness, attempts to process a reality that contradicted every certainty they had built their lives upon. Heidi's letters grew longer and more philosophical. "What does it mean," she wrote one night, "that we were starving while fighting people who had so much food they could afford to waste it? What kind of war were we really fighting? I thought we were defending Germany against enemies who wanted to destroy us. But these people do not act like destroyers. They act like they are trying to rebuild us." The most painful letters were the ones that questioned everything that had come before. Captain Constance Whitmore sat in her office reviewing incident reports from the women's barracks and finding them remarkably unremarkable. 3 weeks into housing German female prisoners, there had been no fights, no escape attempts, no disciplinary issues beyond minor infractions of schedule. The 8 women followed rules, performed assigned tasks, and showed what appeared to be genuine cooperation with camp personnel. This should have been cause for satisfaction. Instead, it created a problem she had not anticipated. Lieutenant Colonel Fairbanks had called her to his office that morning with a question that revealed the complexity of their situation. "Connie, these German women are adjusting too well. Headquarters is asking questions about whether we are being too lenient." She had expected criticism about being too harsh, not too kind. "Sir, we are following Geneva Convention protocols for prisoner treatment. We provide adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Nothing more." Fairbanks had leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. Adequate is an interesting word. The rations these women receive are the same as our own troops. For someone coming from starvation conditions, adequate looks like luxury. There are people in Washington concerned about perception. The perception problem was multifaceted. American newspapers had begun running stories about German prisoners of war receiving better food than some civilians could obtain with their ration books. The fact that these particular prisoners were women complicated the narrative further. Some editorials praised American humanitarian values. Others questioned whether enemies should receive such generous treatment while American boys were still dying in the Pacific. Captain Whitmore understood both perspectives, but she had spent 3 weeks watching these women transform. She had seen Heidi arrive weighing less than 90 pounds and watched her slowly regain physical health. She had observed the initial hostility in their eyes soften into something approaching trust. She had witnessed what happened when you treated people with basic human dignity, even when they had been labeled as enemies. But she also recognized the danger in becoming too personally invested. These were prisoners of war, not refugees she was helping to rehabilitate. Her duty was to maintain security and follow protocols, not to facilitate some grand experiment in cross-cultural understanding. Yet that was exactly what seemed to be happening in Barrack 7. Corporal O'Brien had reported that the German women had begun teaching each other English during evening hours, using a battered dictionary someone had donated. Sergeant Nakamura mentioned that several of the women had volunteered to help with kitchen duties beyond their required work assignments. The camp doctor noted that their physical health was improving, but expressed concern about their psychological state, saying they seemed almost afraid to believe their current situation was real. That afternoon, Captain Whitmore walked to Barrack 7 for an unannounced inspection. She found the women engaged in quiet activities. Heidi was reading an English-language newspaper, her lips moving silently as she worked through unfamiliar vocabulary. Gerlinda and Notburga were mending uniforms, their stitches neat and precise. The others were writing letters or simply resting on their bunks. They stood at attention when she entered, their military training asserting itself automatically. "At ease," she said, and they relaxed slightly, though tension remained visible in their postures. She studied them for a long moment, these young women who had served the Third Reich and now found themselves dependent on American mercy. The transformation happened gradually through the medium of food, each meal a small negotiation between what the German women expected and what America provided. By their 4th week at Camp Claybourne, the initial shock had evolved into something more complex. They no longer stared at their breakfast trays in disbelief, but the abundance still carried weight beyond simple nutrition. Food had become a language for things that could not be spoken directly. Sergeant Nakamura had begun teaching basic cooking techniques to the women who volunteered for kitchen duty. Heidi found herself standing at an industrial stove, learning to crack eggs efficiently, a skill that seemed absurd given that eggs had been luxury items for the past 2 years. But Sergeant Nakamura was patient, demonstrating the motion until Heidi could do it smoothly, the shells breaking cleanly without fragments falling into the bowl. "In Japan, my grandmother taught me to cook when I was very small," Sergeant Nakamura said while they worked. "She said food is how you show love when you do not have words." She paused, watching Heidi practice. "I think maybe it is also how you show respect, how you tell someone they matter." The observation lingered in Heidi's mind. Was that what was happening here? Were the Americans telling them they mattered by feeding them so well? It seemed impossible, yet she could not identify another explanation. They were prisoners, enemies, representatives of a regime that had brought terrible destruction to the world. Yet they received the same food as American soldiers, were treated with basic courtesy, and were offered opportunities to work and learn. Walpurga had taken to baking, discovering an unexpected talent for bread making. She worked alongside an American private named Tommy Martinez from New Mexico, who taught her English words for ingredients while she taught him German terms. Their conversations were fractured and grammatically chaotic, but meaning emerged through shared purpose. Flour became male, sugar became Zucker, and in the process of making bread, something like friendship began to form. The question of whether such friendships were appropriate, whether they represented betrayal or simply human connection, remained unresolved. The 8 women discussed it during their private evening conversations, their voices low and uncertain. Ludmila Graf, called Mila, argued that accepting American kindness did not mean abandoning their German identity. "We can be grateful without being traitors," she insisted. But Crescentia disagreed. At 19, she still possessed the absolutism of youth. How can we accept food from people our country was trying to destroy? How can we laugh with them, learn from them, when German soldiers are still fighting and dying? Heidi had no answer. She only knew that hunger had taught her something about human nature that propaganda had obscured. When you were starving, the person who gave you food became something more than an enemy. They became the reason you survived another day. And survival, she was learning, created its own moral complexities that simple notions of loyalty could not address. "The taste of freedom," she wrote in her unsent letter that night, "is not what I expected." April 12, 1945. The day arrived with ordinary sunshine and the smell of coffee from the mess hall. But by afternoon, everything had changed. Corporal O'Brien brought newspapers to Barrack 7, her expression grim as she distributed them among the 8 German women. "Captain Whitmore thought you should see these," she said quietly. "Better you hear it from us than rumors." The newspapers contained photographs that would haunt Heidi for the rest of her life. Allied forces had liberated concentration camps across Germany and Poland. The images were grainy but clear enough. Skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood. Living prisoners who looked more like walking corpses than human beings. Mass graves, gas chambers, systematic extermination on a scale that defied comprehension. Heidi stared at a photograph from a place called Bergen-Belsen. The caption explained that British forces had found tens of thousands of unburied corpses and thousands more prisoners dying from starvation and disease. She read the words twice, 3 times, unable to reconcile them with anything she understood about the world. This could not be Germany. This could not be the country she had served. Gerlinda was crying, her hands shaking as she held the newspaper. "They are lying," she whispered in German. "This is Allied propaganda. They are making this up to justify what they did to our cities." But her voice carried no conviction. She wanted it to be lies, needed it to be lies, yet the photographs held a terrible authenticity that propaganda could not manufacture. Notberga had gone very still, her face drained of color. She was reading an article about Dachau, about political prisoners and Jews and homosexuals and others deemed undesirable by the Reich. "I knew people who disappeared," she said softly. "Neighbors who were there one day and gone the next. We were told they had been relocated. We were told they were being resettled in the East." Her voice broke. "We believed it because it was easier than asking questions." The revelations continued over the following days. More camps were liberated, more photographs appeared. Testimony from survivors described systematic murder on an industrial scale. The German women at Camp Claybourne read everything they could find, their faces reflecting horror and shame and disbelief in equal measure. Captain Whitmore visited the barracks 3 days after the first newspapers arrived. She found the women sitting in stunned silence, newspapers spread across bunks and tables like evidence at a trial. "I am sorry you had to see this," she said, "but you needed to know what your country did." Heidi looked up at her, tears streaming down her face. "We did not know," she said in careful English. "You must believe us. We did not know this was happening." Even as she said it, she wondered if ignorance was simply another form of complicity. They had not asked questions. They had accepted the explanations they were given. They had focused on their own survival while others were being murdered. That night, every woman in Barrack 7 wrote letters they would never send, attempting to apologize for things they had not done, but had somehow participated in through their silence. The photographs from the liberated camps became an unbearable presence in Barrack 7. Corporal O'Brien had left the newspapers, and the German women returned to them. Compulsively, as if repeated exposure might somehow make the images less horrifying or more comprehensible. Neither happened. Each viewing only deepened the terrible certainty that their entire understanding of Germany had been built on foundations of lies. Heidi found herself unable to eat breakfast the morning after seeing the first photographs. She sat at the table with her tray before her. The eggs and spam and toast that had once seemed miraculous now looking obscene in their abundance. How could she eat this food while looking at images of people starved to death by her own countrymen? How could she accept American kindness when Germans had shown such systematic cruelty? Sergeant Nakamura noticed her untouched tray. "You need to eat," she said gently, sitting down across from Heidi. "Not eating does not change what happened. It only hurts you." Heidi wanted to argue, to explain that she did not deserve to eat, but Sergeant Nakamura continued. "I know what you are feeling. When my family was in the internment camp, we learned about things the Japanese military had done in China, the rape of Nanking. Other atrocities. I felt ashamed to be Japanese, even though I had never been to Japan, even though I had nothing to do with those crimes." "How did you bear it?" Heidi asked, her English rough with emotion. "How did you live with knowing?" "By choosing to be different," Sergeant Nakamura replied. "By deciding that I would not add to the world's cruelty, by doing small kindnesses when I could." She gestured at the food, like making sure people eat. The conversation in Barrack 7 that evening was the most intense since their arrival. The 8 women sat in a circle on the floor, speaking in rapid German, their voices rising and falling with emotion. They were trying to understand their own complicity, to measure the distance between what they had known and what they should have known. While Purga argued that they had been victims of propaganda, that they could not be blamed for believing what their government told them. But Irmtraud countered that there had been signs, whispers, disappearances that they had chosen not to investigate. "We were afraid to ask questions," she said, "but fear is not the same as innocence." Ludmilla raised the uncomfortable possibility that some part of them had known, had suspected, but had buried that knowledge because confronting it would have been too dangerous or too costly. "When my Jewish neighbors disappeared in '38, she said quietly, I told myself they had emigrated. I knew that probably was not true, but believing it was easier than accepting what might really have happened." Heidi listened to her companions dissect their own moral failures and recognized that she had done the same. She had heard rumors about camps, about harsh treatment of Jews, about policies that seemed cruel, but she had been young, she told herself. She had trusted her leaders. She had believed in Germany's righteousness. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the continent for nearly 6 years had officially ended. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Across America, celebrations erupted with church bells and ticker-tape parades and crowds flooding the streets in jubilation. At Camp Claybourne, the American personnel marked the occasion with a special dinner and an evening of music and dancing. The 8 German women remained in Barracks 7, listening to the sounds of celebration filtering through their windows. They had been told they could attend the festivities if they wished, that no one would object to their presence. But the invitation felt hollow. How could they celebrate the defeat of their own country, even knowing what they now knew about what Germany had done? Heidi sat on her bunk, writing in her notebook. "Today, my country died," she wrote in German. Not the Germany that actually existed, with its camps and its cruelty and its monstrous crimes. That Germany deserves to die. But the Germany I believed in, the one I thought I was serving, that Germany died too. Maybe it never existed at all. Maybe I invented it because I needed to believe I was part of something good. Gerlinde had accepted Captain Whitmore's invitation and attended the celebration. She returned to the barracks after 2 hours, her face flushed with confusion and alcohol. "They toasted me," she said to the others in German. "The American soldiers. They toasted to the German people, who deserve better than what they got." I did not know how to respond. We are the German people. We are what Germany was. The philosophical question hung heavy in the air. Were they victims or perpetrators? Were they both? Could you be complicit in crimes you genuinely did not know were being committed? And if ignorance was not innocence, what exactly were they guilty of? Not Burga, who at 32 was the oldest among them, spoke with the authority of her years. We are guilty of not asking harder questions, of taking the easy path, of trusting when we should have doubted. Those are real failures, real sins. But they are not the same as putting people in gas chambers. We need to be honest about both things, what we did wrong and what we did not do. The distinction mattered because it determined what came next. If they were truly criminals, they deserved punishment. But if they were something more complicated, people who had been deceived and who had failed to resist that deception with sufficient vigor, then perhaps they deserved something different. Not absolution, but the opportunity to do better. The question of what doing better would look like remained unanswered. The war was over. Germany was defeated and occupied. Their own futures were completely uncertain. They existed in a strange limbo, neither prisoners of war in the traditional sense, nor free to determine their own paths. That night, as victory celebrations continued outside the 8, women lay in their bunks and contemplated the ruins of everything they had believed. The week following Germany's surrender brought a flood of information about conditions in the defeated nation. Newspapers described cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, millions of refugees displaced, and an economy in complete collapse. The Germany these women would be returning to bore no resemblance to the country they had left. It was a nation occupied by foreign armies, its government dissolved, its future uncertain. Captain Whitmore called a meeting with the 8 women on May 15th to discuss repatriation procedures. She sat at a table in the barracks common area, official documents spread before her, and addressed them in clear, measured English while a translator stood ready. The War Department has issued guidelines for returning prisoners of war to Germany. Transportation will be arranged within the next several weeks. You will be processed through displaced persons camps before being released. Heidi listened to the words and felt nothing resembling relief or joy. Return to what? Her last letter from home had come in November of 1943, before the heavy bombing campaigns had intensified. She had no idea if her parents were alive, if her childhood home still stood, if Stuttgart existed as anything more than ruins. The International Red Cross had been searching for information about her family, but so far, there had been no news. Gerlinda's situation was even more desperate. Her entire family had lived in Dresden, and the reports about that city's destruction in February were apocalyptic. Tens of thousands killed in firebombing raids. The historic city center completely obliterated. The likelihood that her parents and sister had survived seemed minimal. What was she returning to except confirmation of loss? But beyond the practical questions of survival and reunion, there was a deeper problem. These women had changed during their months at Camp Claybourne. They had seen abundance after starvation. They had experienced kindness from supposed enemies. They had learned that the world was more complicated than propaganda had suggested. They had discovered that Americans were not monsters and that Germans were capable of monstrous things. How could they return to Germany carrying this knowledge? How could they live among people who might still believe the old lies, who might resent them for having been captured, who might see their transformation as a betrayal? And how could they participate in rebuilding a nation whose foundations had been revealed as rotten? Walpurga asked the question that was on everyone's mind, Captain Whitmore, if we return to Germany, what will we find there? Who will we be? Her English had improved dramatically, and she spoke with careful precision. We are not the same women who left. Germany is not the same country. Where do we belong now? Captain Whitmore had no easy answer. I cannot tell you. What you will find, she said honestly. Germany is in chaos. There is hunger, destruction, and uncertainty. But it is still your home, your people, your language, and your culture. She paused. Though I understand it may not feel that way anymore. May 22nd, 1945. The morning began like any other, but Heidi had not slept. She had spent the entire night in whispered conversation with the 7 other women, their voices low and urgent, as they debated a decision that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. By dawn, they had reached a consensus that would have been unthinkable 3 months earlier. After breakfast, Heidi approached Captain Whitmore with a request that made her hands shake. "Captain, may I speak with you privately, and perhaps the other women can come also." Her English had become fluent, though stress made her accent thicker. Captain Whitmore agreed, her expression curious, and within an hour, all 8 German women stood in the camp commander's office. Lieutenant Colonel Fairbanks sat behind his desk, Captain Whitmore stood to his right, and the 8 prisoners faced them in a nervous line. Heidi had been chosen as their spokesperson. She clasped her hands to stop them trembling and began speaking in careful, measured English. "Sir Captain, we have been discussing the repatriation orders. We understand that we are prisoners and that we must return to Germany if that is what is required." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "But we wish to make a request that is unusual, perhaps unprecedented. Some of us, we do not want to return to Germany immediately. We would like to ask if there is any way we could remain here in America for a longer time, perhaps permanently." The silence that followed was absolute. Lieutenant Colonel Fairbanks leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Let me make sure I understand correctly. You are asking to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom to return to your homeland?" Gerlinda stepped forward, her voice stronger than Heidi's. "It is not captivity anymore, sir. Not really. We have been treated with kindness here. We have learned things about ourselves and about Germany that make it very difficult to imagine going back. The Germany we would be returning to is not the Germany we believed we were serving," Captain Whitmore interjected, her tone carefully neutral. "This is highly irregular. I am not aware of any protocol for prisoners requesting to remain after cessation of hostilities." "What exactly are you asking for?" Notburga spoke next, her English less polished, but her meaning clear. "We know what our country did. We have seen the photographs. We have read about the camps. We cannot pretend we do not know anymore. Going back to Germany means living with people who may still believe the old lies, or who will blame us for losing the war, or who will hate us for being captured." Walpurga added, "Here we have found something we did not expect. We have found the possibility of being different people than we were. We have found forgiveness we do not deserve. We have found that our enemies treated us better than our own country treated so many innocent people." The 8 women stood together, united in their unprecedented request. They were asking for something that had no precedent in military law or international convention. They were asking to be allowed to stay with their former captors. Lieutenant Colonel Fairbanks sent an urgent telegram to the War Department in Washington. The response took 3 days to arrive, during which the 8 German women existed in a state of suspended uncertainty. They continued their daily routines, working in the kitchen, attending English lessons, performing assigned tasks. But everything felt fragile, temporary, as if the entire structure of their new lives might collapse at any moment. Captain Whitmore visited the barracks each evening to check on them. She found them subdued but not despairing, waiting with the patience of people who had learned that they had no control over their own fates. On the second night, she sat with them and asked the question that had been troubling her. Why America? Why not simply request to remain in Europe, perhaps in the British or French zones? Heidi answered for the group. Because here, we have learned what it means to have enough. We have seen abundance that is shared, not hoarded. We have met Sergeant Nakamura, who showed us that you can love a country even when it has failed you. We have found that kindness is possible even between enemies. She paused, searching for the right words. In Europe, we would still be German women who serve the Reich. Here, perhaps we can become something else. The response from Washington arrived on May 26th. It was bureaucratic and cautious, as such communications always were, but it contained an unexpected opening. The War Department would not prevent voluntary repatriation of any prisoner who wished to return immediately. However, Given the unusual circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, those who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons pending further evaluation. The critical detail was what came next. As displaced persons rather than prisoners of war, they would need to find American sponsors willing to provide housing and employment. They would need to demonstrate self-sufficiency. They would need to navigate the complex immigration system. And they would need to do all of this while carrying the stigma of having been enemy nationals. When Captain Whitmore explained these terms, she watched the women's faces carefully. "This is not an easy path," she warned. "You will face suspicion and hostility. Some Americans will never forgive you for being German, regardless of what you knew or did not know. You will be foreigners in a country that just fought a war against your homeland. Are you certain this is what you want?" The 8 women looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Then Crescentia, the youngest at 19, spoke. "It is not about easy or hard. It is about where we can become people we are not ashamed to be. In Germany, we would always carry the weight of what our country did. Here, perhaps we can help show that not all Germans were monsters, but the decision was not unanimous." Over the next 2 days, reality imposed itself on idealism. Irmtraud announced that she would return to Germany after all. "My mother is elderly and alone," she explained. "I cannot abandon her, even for this opportunity." Ludmilla made a similar choice, having received word through the Red Cross that her sister and 2 nephews had survived and were in a refugee camp. By early June, the 8 had become 6. Irmtraud and Ludmilla departed for Germany with tears and promises to write, carrying with them American chocolate and letters to deliver if they could find the addresses. The 6 who remained, Heidi, Gerlinde, Notburga, Walpurga, Crescentia, and Hemma Schuster, faced the daunting task of finding sponsors and building entirely new lives. The process began with unexpected allies. Sergeant Nakamura's family in Sacramento, recently returned from internment and rebuilding their strawberry farm, offered to sponsor Heidi. They had never met her, but Sergeant Nakamura had written to them about the German woman who asked thoughtful questions and learned quickly. "My parents understand what it means to be judged for things you did not do," she told Heidi. "They want to help." Captain Whitmore's own family in Massachusetts offered to sponsor Gerlinde. The captain's mother, a widow who ran a boarding house in Cambridge, had lost her husband in the Great War, but believed in second chances. "If these women are trying to become better," she had written to her daughter, "then we should help them do that." Local churches stepped forward to sponsor the others. A Lutheran congregation in New Orleans offered housing and employment to Notburga and Walpurga. A Catholic parish in Baton Rouge did the same for Crescentia and Hemma. The process was not without controversy. Several church members objected to helping former enemies, arguing that charity should be reserved for American families struggling with wartime rationing and loss. But Reverend Thomas McKinley, the Lutheran pastor, made a persuasive case. "These women came here as enemies," he said from his pulpit. "They were starving, and we fed them. They were confused, and we showed them truth. They were lost, and we offered them direction. Now they are asking for the chance to build new lives based on what they have learned. Refusing them would make our previous kindness meaningless." The immigration paperwork was extensive and complex. Each woman needed documentation, background checks, health examinations, and sworn statements about their wartime activities. They needed to prove they had not been members of the Nazi Party, had not participated in atrocities, and posed no security threat. The investigations took weeks. During this time, the 6 women remained at Camp Claybourne in a strange liminal state. They were no longer prisoners, but not yet free. They could move about the camp without restriction, but could not leave the grounds. They worked alongside American personnel, earning small wages that would help them begin their new lives. They studied English intensively, preparing for a world where their survival would depend on communication. Heidi spent hours with Sergeant Nakamura, learning not just language, but cultural expectations. Americans value directness, Sergeant Nakamura explained. They will ask you questions about Germany, about the war. You cannot avoid these conversations. You must be honest about what you knew and did not know, about your regrets and your hopes. The hardest preparation was emotional. Each woman grappled privately with what it meant to leave Germany behind, not just physically, but psychologically. 25 years later, on a bright morning in May 1970, Adelheid Baumann Nakamura stood in her kitchen in Sacramento, California, preparing breakfast for her 2 teenage children. She cracked eggs into a bowl with the efficient precision that Florence Nakamura had taught her decades earlier. The familiar motion brought her back to that first morning at Camp Claybourne, when she had stared at a breakfast tray and asked if it was Sunday. Her children, Michael and Sarah, were arguing about whether Spam was acceptable for breakfast. They had grown up with abundance and could afford to be selective about their food. Heidi listened to their complaint and smiled, though neither child understood why their mother found the conversation amusing. How could she explain to these American-born teenagers that their pickiness about Spam represented a kind of freedom their mother had once thought impossible? The story of the 6 German women who chose to stay in America had become a quiet legend in certain circles. Not widely known, but whispered about in immigration offices and church basements and among people who believed in second chances. Heidi had married Sergeant Nakamura's brother Thomas in 1948, creating a family that embodied multiple kinds of reconciliation. Their wedding had been small but meaningful, attended by the other 5 women who had made the same impossible choice. Gerlinda had become a teacher in Cambridge, specializing in German language instruction. She taught American students about German culture with an honesty that acknowledged both its beauty and its capacity for darkness. She never married, dedicating her life instead to building bridges between the country of her birth and the country of her choice. Notburga and Walpurga had opened a bakery in New Orleans where they made both German and American breads. Their shop became a gathering place for displaced persons from various countries, a space where people who did not quite belong anywhere could find temporary belonging with each other. The smell of fresh bread became their contribution to their adopted city. Crescentia had married an American soldier named Robert Chen, the same man who had been a guard at Camp Claybourne. Their interracial marriage faced hostility in some quarters, but they built a life anyway, raising 4 children who grew up speaking both German and English. Hema had become a nurse, working in veterans' hospitals, caring for men who had fought against Germany with the same dedication Sergeant Nakamura had shown in feeding hungry prisoners. The 6 women had maintained contact through letters and occasional visits. They had watched each other's children grow up, celebrated successes, and mourned losses together. They had become American while remaining German, creating identities that honored both parts of their complicated histories. They had never forgotten where they came from or what had brought them to America. The photographs from the liberated concentration camps remained in their memories, a permanent reminder of what they had unknowingly served. But they had also never forgotten the Spam and eggs, the moment when abundance shattered propaganda and forced them to question everything. That breakfast tray had been the beginning of their transformation, the first crack in the wall of lies they had built their lives upon.